talking about how the various democracies around the world deal with the question of a leader who has done some bad deed while in office. Basically, a lot of countries grant their leaders some form of criminal immunity while they're in power, but with the caveat that they are also subject to removal from office for basically any offense that the legislature deems serious enough to justify their removal, which could be a criminal offense, but it doesn't have to be. Procedures like impeachments or votes of no confidence are pretty unapologetically political decisions made by politicians, and thus can be fairly accurately characterized as having somewhat low standards of evidence and judgment. But once a leader is out of office, any immunity they enjoyed, whether formal or informal, is unambiguously stripped. They return to being an ordinary citizen and are thus theoretically accountable to the ordinary legal system in the same way that you or I are, including for deeds they committed while in office. To the extent they enjoy any special protection from the laws, it is usually more a result of what they call prosecutorial discretion. We can say, as a general rule, that more crimes are being committed than people actually get charged for, which reflects the limited resources of police and prosecutors. Prosecutors in particular have to make judgment calls about when someone is worth taking through the entire judicial process. And a cynic might argue that prosecuting a former leader is just too controversial of an act and too likely to be misunderstood by the public to be worth risking the integrity of the whole prosecutorial system over, as we discussed. This was part of the reason why US President Gerald Ford, who served briefly in the 1970s, made the decision to grant a full and unconditional pardon to the man who had come before him, Richard Nixon, in 1974. Nixon was pretty widely believed to have committed at least some crimes due to his involvement in the so-called Watergate conspiracy, which involved various criminal plots against his political enemies that many of his underlings did wind up going to prison for. But as Ford put it,
many months and perhaps more years will have to pass before Richard Nixon could obtain a fair trial by jury in any jurisdiction of the United States under governing decisions of the Supreme Court.
Now, nobody came to the defense of former Japanese Prime Minister Kakue Tanaka, however. Tanaka resigned from office just a few months after Nixon in December of 1974, following growing unpopularity and allegations of corruption. Those allegations became far more tangible when he was arrested in July of 1976 on charges of accepting bribes while in office. In February of that year, American officials within the powerful Lockheed Martin Aircraft Corporation had testified that they had paid millions of dollars in bribes to Japanese politicians in order to secure contracts with that country's largest airline. Over the course of Tanaka's 7-year trial, it was revealed that the Prime Minister had accepted over $2.1 million in bribes as part of this conspiracy, and in 1983, he was found guilty and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He never actually served any time, however, because he immediately appealed, and as we saw, the Japanese legal system doesn't exactly move with cheetah-like swiftness. He died in 1993, having been in the appeals process for nearly a decade at that point. Japan being Japan, the Prime Minister's illegal escapades were later immortalized in a video game. Chancellor Helmut Kohl was one of the great German statesmen of the 20th century, known for presiding over the peaceful reunification of East and West Germany in 1990. He ruled the United Germany for 8 years before losing his bid for a 5th term in 1998. A year later, in late 1999, German prosecutors announced that they were opening a criminal investigation into Kohl on charges that he had accepted illegal donations to his political party while in office. Under German law, any amount of money a political party receives from a donor has to be publicly disclosed, the donor has to be named, and the donation has to be taxed. Under Kohl's leadership, however, the Christian Democratic Union Party was engaged in a conspiracy to avoid all of these legal obligations. They had set up all of these secret back channels to accept large tax-free donations from donors who were able to keep their identities anonymous. Kohl's lawyers quickly entered into negotiations with prosecutors to avoid a trial, and with it a possible jail sentence of as much as 5 years. In 2001, it was announced that prosecutors would drop the case in exchange for Cole paying a fine of $144,000. Though Cole was never accused of personally enriching himself through the illegal donations, the criminal investigation did a lot to ruin his reputation in Germany, and when he died in 2017, it often loomed as large in his obituaries as his work securing German reunification. A somewhat similar story enveloped former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada. A few years after he resigned in 1993, it was alleged that a major decision he had made in office, his administration's 1988 purchase of 34 jets from the Airbus Corporation for Canada's state-run airline, had been influenced by millions of dollars in kickbacks he received from an Airbus lobbyist. In 1995, the Canadian Department of Justice announced that it was formally investigating the relationship between Mulroney and the lobbyist, whose name was Karl-Heinz Schreiber. The criminal investigation was ultimately abandoned due to lack of evidence, however, but the nature of the relationship between the two men continued to be the subject of high-level scrutiny for many years to come. Mulroney would eventually admit to accepting $225,000 from Schreiber after he left office, but maintained it was for things other than the Airbus contract. This whole affair is actually one of the most convoluted stories in modern Canadian political history, and I'm summarizing it very broadly. Even though no criminal charges were ever filed against the two men by Canadian authorities, to this day, there is still a lot that we don't know about the true nature of their financial relationship. A lot of details have been revealed through the course of numerous criminal and political investigations, however, and Mulroney has not exactly come out looking stellar. A situation that is considerably less ambiguous is the post-prime ministerial career of Silvio Berlusconi of Italy. Berlusconi was not only Italy's longest-serving prime minister since World War II, but a powerful Italian media baron and the country's richest man. He was also bound up in all sorts of legally dubious shenanigans, both in and outside his time in the prime ministership, and by my count, has gone on trial no fewer than 5 times since leaving office in 2011. Though it's worth noting that his whole situation is kind of interesting, in that right near the end of his term, the Italian Supreme Court overruled the law granting prime ministers criminal immunity, meaning that some of these charges were technically filed during his final weeks in office. Berlusconi's first trial in 2011 is perhaps the one he is most notorious for. The prime minister was accused of having sex over a dozen times with a 17-year-old prostitute the year before during his so-called bunga bunga parties. He was found guilty in 2013, but the verdict was eventually overturned on appeal. The court ruled that he had not known how old she was. In 2012, the former prime minister was found guilty of tax fraud after prosecutors successfully proved that he had been engaged in an elaborate scheme of concealing the true amounts of money that he had been making buying and selling the foreign distribution rights to American movies. He served 10 months of community service. In 2013, he was found guilty of publishing an illegally wiretapped conversation of one of his political enemies in one of his newspapers back in 2005. He was sentenced to a year in prison, but he appealed, and during the appeals process, the statute of limitations conveniently ran out, so he didn't wind up facing any punishment. In 2015, he was found guilty of bribing an Italian senator in the early 2000s in order to get him to switch political parties and oppose the man who was prime minister at that time. It was a complex House of Cards-esque maneuver that I am told helped accelerate Berlusconi's rise to power, and he once again faced no time for this because once again the statute of limitations expired during the appeals process. And then from 2021 to 2022, he faced 3 separate trials on charges that he had bribed 24 different witnesses in the Bunga Bunga case. He was found not guilty in all 3, with the most recent trial just wrapping up this past February. So Prime Minister Berlusconi has often been compared to Trump in the sense that they are both these sort of flamboyant, sex-crazed billionaires who made the shift to right-wing politics, but also because they have both been very quick to allege that any criminal prosecution they face is the result of an elaborate left-wing political conspiracy against them. In both cases, this argument has helped keep their political base loyal, but it hasn't really been all that persuasive to more moderate voters who perhaps have a bit more faith in the